Question 7. Looking back at your preliminary task, what do you feel you have learnt in the progression from it to the full product? So for the quality of holding a steady shot, um, for a preliminary task, I used the tripod a lot. This meant that we had a lot of shots where the shots were very steady, but I personally thought this was a bit repetitive and it didn't create for an interesting cinematography. So for a real main task, I decided to use freehand a lot. I was able to actually get the camera steady for most of the time, although there were a few times when it did get a bit shaky. Um, my steadiness was most effective with the tracking shots. Um, so for the quality of the framing shots, for a preliminary task, since it was very rushed, they weren't amazing, but their meaning was still apparent to the viewer. And it also felt a bit artificial because the shots weren't really planned properly, and then things would just awkwardly jump from one shot to another shot. So for our main task, we used a detailed storyboard. This allowed us to actually know where to position our camera and actors in the frame. And we also constantly referred back to the storyboard when carrying out our principal photography. For the quality of shooting material appropriate to the task set, i.e. the content of your film pre and post editing, was consistent with the exam directives. So we did include a lot of match-on action scenes, such as the bit where Orla is turning around, walking away from Izzy, and we also did record each of our shots multiple times. This allowed us to have more options while Callum is editing the clips together. For the quality of selecting the mise-en-scene, including colour, figure, lighting, objects and setting. So for our preliminary task, we didn't really put much thought into our mise-en-scene. We just sort of used what was close to our school. So we used the Fursdown Recreational Park. For our main task, we decided to go with more recognisable locations such as London, South Bank and Tooting Station. This would be good for the audience as they'll be able to relate to the actual media product. We also decided to use a messy bedroom to portray Izzy's working class background and her unorganized character. And I think a lot of teenagers or our target market can actually relate to this as well. For the lighting, we used lighting very effectively with our final product. So, for instance, in the beginning of the product, we see a lot of sort of orange tinted shots with the lighting, so it sort of creates a nice warm atmosphere. But then, as soon as she opened the door, you saw the sort of blue sort of color background to like the outside shots, and it just represents the harsh, cold reality that she needs to face. So there's a nice contrast created there. For the quality of editing, so that meaning is apparent to the viewer, we use a lot of slow and fast-paced editing. So towards the beginning, we start off slow, like she's just woken up, she still feels a bit disorientated. And then it starts to get faster and faster as she gets ready to leave the house. This sort of creates questions in the audience as to like why is it going so fast all of a sudden? Maybe she's late to something. It's really up to viewer interpretation with that. Quality of using sound with images and editing appropriately to the task set. So for our preliminary task, there was a lot of ambient sound, which we didn't really want. It was really really loud, and it didn't work with the clips. It sort of ruined the continuity editing we had going on. So for our final product, we did record different types of ambient noise. So we did one for inside the house, where most of there's not much noise to it. Um, but then for the outside, we had things like the wind blowing, and like traffic, cars, and skate park sounds and things like that. Um, yep, and we also, for the voice dubbing, we didn't put much thought into that for our preliminary task. So we just used what was recorded, so you couldn't really hear the actors properly. We decided to actually dub our final product, so all of it is recorded post filming. So for the quality of positioning and movements of actors, for so far our preliminary task, we didn't actually have a director present when we were filming. So things were really unorganized. We didn't really know what we were shooting. We sort of avoided the storyboards instead of following it, which we should have done. So for our actual final product, we did have a director present when we were recording. In this case, Orla. Alongside acting, she did also direct, and she did a really good job at it. So the director allowed us to make sure that we stuck to the storyboards, and it also meant that the positioning of the characters in the frame were also just as we sort of had in mind with the storyboard, so we didn't change anything while we were outside recording. Quality of group planning, meeting targets, and organization. So for a preliminary task, it was really rushed, so we didn't really have much meetings or discussions. It was more, we had one lesson to just sort of make the storyboard, and plus it was only two of us in that lesson as well, so it made things really difficult and complicated. Luckily for our actual final product, we did have meetings and discussions to talk about what we were actually going to do. There were times when people just didn't turn up to lessons, so we had to catch them up on what we were talking about and what we were going to do. So this just made sure that the people who were not present at the lessons were caught up with everything. We did sometimes struggle to meet targets. So for instance, we wanted to maybe perhaps record everything in like the first 2 days. Unfortunately, that did not happen. We did have to have an extra day, but we still did get the job done. Yep. And for group dynamics, i.e., how did your group work together? So for our preliminary task, I did know everyone individually quite well. Perhaps they didn't know each other quite well, which maybe there could have been some awkward moments or just trying to get to know each other. So there was that. But for our final product, by this point, we all knew each other moderately well. We knew what our strengths and weaknesses were, so that made working together much easier. And then for things like discussions, maybe we did have to make some compromises so that everyone did have their ideas incorporated. But in the end, I think that's what makes our final product really good and effective. And so for other points of evaluation, e.g. equipment related, so since I was a cameraman, for most of the times I had to work the camera a lot, of course. So using a DSLR camera, I've used it a lot since GCSE as well. So I do have good knowledge of how to use a camera, but for things like maybe perhaps making my shots steadier, I could have improved on that by perhaps not using a tripod but maybe a stabilizer. So a stabilizer compensates for the sort of shakiness caused with cameras. And then with that, it also just allows me to move with the camera instead of having to be static with the tripod.